Imagine, if you can, a world where the setting sun doesn't signal rest, but the start of a grim shift, where the currency of survival isn't coins, but the very essence of your being, measured in increments of pain and profound risk. This isn't the plot of a dystopian novel. This was the daily reality for the medieval prostitute. And the most shocking, dark fact about her day wasn't the sex. It was that sex was often the least dangerous part of it. Her day began not in a velvet-draped chamber, but in a desperate calculation of emptiness. The gnawing in her stomach was her first employer, more insistent than any brothel keeper. There was no work without a license, no guild to protect her, only the brutal economics of scarcity. If she was in a city with official stews like Southwark in London, she was legally confined to that swampy, isolated district, a societal leper forced to live on the wrong side of the river, literally and metaphorically. The bridge across the Thames wasn't just a passage. It was a border into a world of the condemned. As dusk fell, her true peril commenced. The law in many places forbade her from carrying a candle after dark. Think on that. In a world of pitch black, unpaved streets, rancid with waste and populated by thieves and predators, she was legally denied light. This wasn't an oversight, it was a design. It made her a perfect victim, ensuring she remained visible only as a commodity in the shadows, never as a human who might see, identify, or testify against a client of higher standing. The darkness that swallowed her was both physical and judicial. Then came the negotiation. A swift, crude barter where her safety was the first thing traded away. The client held all the power of class, of gender, of physical force. The concept of consent, as we understand it, was non-existent. Her yes was a transaction of survival, her no a luxury that could mean a beating, rape without payment. The city does not wake gently. It is not roused by the soft, gray light of dawn seeping through shutters, but by a deeper, more fundamental ache. For the woman whose world is the margins, the day begins not with a bell or a bird, but with a hollow, grinding emptiness in her stomach. This is her first taskmaster, more immediate and more cruel than any brothel keeper or city official. Before there can be any thought of the night to come, there is the simple animal imperative of the morning, to find something, anything, to quiet the gnawing within. Her surroundings offer no comfort. If she is one of the regulated women, living in the official stews, she wakes in a district purpose-built for exclusion. Places like London's Southwark on the marshy south bank of the Thames were deliberate islands of tolerated sin. The air here is thick, not with the promise of a new day, but with the damp, fetid smell of the river and the accumulated waste of a crowded, neglected quarter. The buildings are cheap timber and daub, leaning against one another for support, their interiors dark even at noon. If she is unregulated, a solitary streetwalker, her waking place is even more precarious. A rented corner of a tenement room, a straw pallet in a cellar, the fleeting shelter of a benefactor who may soon become a client. There is no leisurely toilette. Her ablutions are pragmatic, a crude defense against the work. She might wash with cold water from a shared basin, the ritual perfunctory. The cosmetics she applies, if she can afford them, are not for allure, but for a kind of public uniform. A touch of ceruse, a lead-based powder, to mask the pallor of poor diet and sleepless nights. A little color on the cheeks, not to mimic a blush of health, but to signal availability in the dim light of a tavern or the deepening shadows of the alley. Her clothing is chosen for quick identification and easier transaction. In many cities, sumptuary laws dictate her dress, forcing her to wear a striped. Chapter 2. The walk through the filthy streets. The journey from her lodgings to wherever she will station herself for the day is never a simple stroll. It is a calculated navigation of a hostile geography, a slow procession through a physical world that reflects her social standing. The streets themselves are an adversary. In dry weather, they are a churning sea of dust and grit that coats her skin and the hem of her clothes. In wet weather, which is frequent, they become a treacherous bog of mud, deep enough in places to suck a shoe right off her foot. This mud is not clean earth. It is the final repository for all the waste a city produces. It is liquid refuse, churned with the droppings of horses, dogs, and pigs that roam freely. With every cautious step, she must lift her skirts high, not out of modesty, but out of a desperate, practical need to keep the worst of the filth from soaking into the very fabric that defines her. The sounds that surround her are a constant din, a wall of noise that presses in from all sides. The clatter of cart wheels on stone, the shouts of hawkers selling everything from fresh fish to stolen nails, the barking of dogs, the squeal of pigs being driven to slaughter, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Beneath it all is the low, constant hum of human activity, of arguments, of deals being struck, of children crying. She moves through this cacophony not as a participant, but as a ghost. Her voice is not part of the market's chorus. Her business is not conducted in the open, in daylight. The noise is a blanket that could conceal a threat, the hissed insult from a virtuous matron, the leering comment from a gang of apprentices, the sudden grab of a rough hand from a darkened doorway. And then there are the eyes. This is perhaps the most exhausting part of the walk, the relentless scrutiny. The law in many places demands she be known, and so she is. Her striped hood or gown is a beacon. To the authorities, the watchman, the bead. Chapter 3. The legal status of the fallen woman. To understand the precise contours of her day, one must first understand the invisible cage crafted for her by law and custom. She was not simply an individual making a poor choice. She was a legal category, a social problem to be managed. The term fallen woman itself is a theological and legal construct, implying a descent from a state of grace she may never have had the privilege to inhabit. In the eyes of the law, her identity was often reduced to a single, stark fact. She was a meretrix, prostitute. This label acted as a kind of civil death, stripping away many of the protections afforded to other women, however limited those might have been. She existed in a paradoxical state of being both condemned and condoned. The Church thundered against the sin of luxuria, lechery, and she was its most visible symbol. Yet, echoing the ancient writings of St. Augustine, many civic authorities adopted a grimly pragmatic view. Prostitution was a necessary evil, a sewer that, by its existence, protected the purity of respectable wives and daughters. This theory did not elevate her. It simply made her a useful cesspool. Therefore, the law's primary aim was not to eliminate her, but to contain her, to regulate her visibility, and to ensure her permanent separation from the virtuous community. This legal containment took physical form. In countless cities across Europe, from London to Paris to Florence, strict ordinances dictated where she could live, work, and even walk. She was often forbidden from residing within the city walls, banished to districts outside the civic boundaries, like Southwark across the Thames from London, or to specifically designated streets. She was prohibited from wearing the fine fabrics, silks, furs, certain jewels, that denoted a woman of status, forced instead into distinctive clothing like striped hoods or yellow kerchiefs that made her instantly recognizable, a walking warning sign. Curfews. Chapter 4. Confined to the stews, the brothel districts. If the law provided the invisible bars of her cage, the stews were its physical manifestation. The term itself, stew, is evocative, borrowed from the steam-filled fish ponds of the time, suggesting something simmering, contained, and vaguely unsavory. These were not merely neighborhoods where prostitution happened. They were municipally sanctioned industrial zones for the management of sin, and crossing into one was to step into a different realm with its own stark rules. The geography was always deliberate. London's most famous stews were in Southwark, directly across the Thames from the towering majesty of St. Paul's Cathedral. To get there, one had to cross London Bridge, a journey that was both physical and symbolic. The bridge was a bustling marketplace of its own, lined with shops and houses, but passing through its southern gate was akin to passing through a portal. You left the jurisdiction of the City of London and entered the liberty of the Clink, an area often under the control of the Bishop of Winchester. Here, the Church's paradoxical role was laid bare. While preaching against carnal sin, it often owned the land and leased the brothel buildings, collecting rents from the very trade it condemned. The moral contradiction was built into the stone and timber. The architecture of the stews spoke of transient utilitarian purpose. Buildings were constructed cheaply and densely, leaning into one another over narrow, foul-smelling alleys that rarely saw sunlight. The ground floors were often given over to taverns or the brothel rooms themselves, while upper floors provided cramped lodging for the women. The riverbank itself was a quagmire, a dumping ground for waste from the district and from the city upstream. The air was perpetually damp from the river mists, which held close the smells of brewing, tanning, and human habitation. Within this district, a grim order prevailed. The brothels were oft. Chapter 5. The Brothel Keeper and the Rules of the House. Within the claustrophobic world of the stews, the brothel keeper, often called a bawd if a woman or a pander if a man, was the undisputed monarch of a tiny, grim kingdom. This figure was the crucial intermediary between the raw economics of survival and the cold mechanics of the law. For the woman living under that roof, the brothel keeper was not just a landlord or employer. They were the immediate architect of daily life, a source of both meager protection and relentless exploitation. The relationship began with a transaction that mirrored the work itself. A woman, often destitute and with no other options, would agree to the keeper's terms. These terms were rarely written but brutally simple. In exchange for a roof over her head, basic sustenance like coarse bread and thin ale, and the theoretical protection of the house, she would surrender the majority of her earnings. The keeper might take half or even 2/3 of every coin she earned. They also controlled the clients, directing men to particular women, settling disputes over payment, and ensuring the frantic pace of business in a crowded room. They provided the room, the straw-filled mattress, perhaps a rough blanket, and little else. Any extra, a cleaner rag, a bit of soap, a slightly better gown to attract higher-paying trade, would be deducted from her share, deepening her debt and tightening her bondage. The rules of the house were a set of pragmatic dictates designed to maximize profit and minimize trouble with the authorities. Women were often forbidden from keeping a private stash of money or gifts from clients. All earnings were to pass through the keeper's hands. They were expected to be available when clients were present, with refusal not a matter of choice but of broken contract. Fighting between the women was prohibited, not out of concern for their well-being, but because it disrupted business. The keeper might impose a curfew. St. Chapter 6. A glimpse inside a medieval brothel room. To step across the threshold of the brothel room is to leave behind even the thin veneer of society that cloaked the district outside. This was the stark, functional stage where the theory of the necessary evil met its crude, daily practice. It was not a boudoir. Any romantic fantasy of velvet drapes, soft cushions, or intimate lighting dissolves instantly in the face of its grim reality. The space was, above all, small. It was a cell, often no larger than a closet, carved out of the warren of the brothel building. The walls were bare timber or flaking plaster, stained with damp and smoke from a poorly vented fire, if there was one at all. There was no fireplace for warmth, only perhaps a shared hearth down the hall whose heat rarely reached this isolated cubicle. The only furniture was the bed, not a piece of comfort, but the tool of the trade. It was a simple wooden frame, its ropes or slats creaking under a thin, lumpy mattress stuffed with straw or, if she was unlucky, moldering hay. This straw was rarely changed, becoming a repository for sweat, filth, and vermin. A coarse wool blanket, threadbare and often sour-smelling, might be folded at its foot. There was no chest for belongings, no chair, no washing stand. A single, stubbed candle on a shelf or in a wall niche provided the only light, its gutter and smoke adding another layer of grime to the air. The smell was a palpable entity, a dense mixture that spoke of relentless use and no true cleaning. It was the scent of old straw and damp wool, of tallow smoke, of unwashed bodies, and the distinct metallic tang of blood. It was undercut by the feeble attempt to mask it all with cheap, strong perfumes or herbs like rosemary and lavender strewn on the floor. A losing battle against the persistent odor of human transaction. The air was cold in winter, stifling and thick in summer, and always close, always breathed by countless others. This room was not a hoe. Chapter 7. The simple and repetitive morning routine. Dawn, in her world, did not herald a fresh beginning, but the resumption of a cycle. The morning routine was a study in minimalism, stripped of all ceremony and focused solely on functionality. It was performed not with hope, but with a weary familiarity, each action a silent preparation for the market of the self that would open later in the day. Waking was not a gentle transition. It was an emergence from a thin, troubled sleep, often broken by the sounds of the district or the departure of a late-night client. The cold of the room was the first sensation to greet her, seeping through the thin blanket. There was no lingering in bed. The day's first task was to assess the small, hard realities of her body, the ache in her joints from the damp, the hunger already tightening its grip, the minor injuries or irritations from the previous night's work that needed tending. This was a mechanical inventory, not one of self-care. Her ablutions were perfunctory and practical. If she had access to water, it was likely drawn from a shared, questionable source, a cistern in the courtyard or the river itself. She would wash her face, her hands, and perhaps her underarms with cold water, the shock of it serving to shake off the last vestiges of sleep. There was no luxurious bathing. Full immersion was a rarity and often considered dangerous to one's health. The goal was not cleanliness as we understand it, but the removal of the most immediate residues of the night, a rudimentary resetting of the canvas. Then came the uniform. Her clothing was donned with the efficiency of a soldier armoring for a familiar battle. The layers were simple. A coarse linen smock against the skin, then her distinctive gown, often mandated to be of a plain, cheap fabric and a specific, identifiable color like red or yellow, or marked with stripes. Her hair, if it was long, would be braided tightly and pinned up, or covered entirely with the require. Chapter 9. The Midday Lull. Waiting for clients. Following the grim calculus of setting a price came its inevitable counterpart, the wait. The frantic commerce of the night was a distant pulse. The morning's preparation was complete. Now entered a long, hollow stretch of time known only to those who sell their presence. The midday lull. This was not leisure. It was a state of suspended animation, a tense and quiet vigil in the marketplace of the self. If she was a streetwalker, this might mean taking up a position in a designated area, a certain bridge, a particular lane, the steps of a market cross. She would stand or lean against a wall, trying to appear available but not desperate, a difficult balance to maintain under the judging sun. The daylight was unforgiving, revealing every fray in her hem, every smudge on her painted cheek, every flicker of fatigue in her eyes. She would watch the flow of people, the legitimate bustle of citizens running errands, wives with baskets, apprentices on deliveries. She was a statue in that current, a fixed point around which they navigated with averted gazes or open scorn. The watchmen made their rounds, their eyes passing over her with institutional indifference, so long as she remained in her allotted zone. If she worked from a tavern or a brothel, the lull was spent in the common room or a back chamber with the other women. Here, the silence was communal, often filled with the small, weary sounds of waiting. The mending of a torn sleeve with clumsy stitches, the slow sipping of weak ale to stave off both thirst and hunger, the soft, rhythmic cracking of lice between thumbnails. Conversation was sparse, functional. A warning about a violent client from the night before, a rumor of a constable in a foul mood, a shared complaint about the ache of a tooth or the stiffness of a bruise. There was little camaraderie in the romantic sense. These women were not sisters in arms, but competitors sharing a lifeboat, their relationships. Chapter 8. The Economics of the Body. Setting a Price. With the uniform donned and the mask applied, the theoretical gave way to the brutally concrete. The central, unending question of her day now presented itself. What was her body worth in this hour on this street to this man? This was not a fixed market with stable prices, but a fluctuating economy of desperation, perception, and immediate need, where her value was as changeable as the weather. There was no standard rate. A complex and unforgiving calculus determined every potential transaction. At the very bottom lay the base currency of simple hunger. If her stomach clenched with emptiness, the price dropped. A stale loaf of bread, a bowl of thin pottage, a single worn coin. These could become acceptable payment when the alternative was another night with no sustenance. Her physical location dictated value. A woman stationed in a slightly better tavern near the market might command a higher fee than one in a stinking alley behind the butcher's row. The perceived hierarchy of the trade itself played a role. A woman working within an official, licensed stew might have a slightly higher baseline price than a solitary streetwalker, who carried the added risks of the open road and no keeper's theoretical protection. Time was a critical factor. The price was higher at the beginning of the night, when her energy and the clients were fresh, and lower in the dead hours before dawn, when exhaustion set in and the need to secure at least some earnings before sunrise became paramount. The client himself was a variable. A well-dressed merchant or a tipsy student from the university could be charged more than a grimy porter or a common soldier. This assessment had to be made in an instant, a gamble based on the cut of his tunic, the clarity of his speech, the confidence in his bearing. Misjudgment could mean a loss of income or a violent confrontation. Beyond the basic coin, payment could take other forms. It might be. Chapter 10. Common Clients. Merchants and Travelers. The rhythm of her day was set not by the sun, but by the tides of trade and travel that flowed through the city gates. Among the most reliable of these human currents were the merchants and travelers. They were not the romantic figures of ballads, but the pragmatic lifeblood of commerce, and they approached her services with the same transactional mindset they applied to a bolt of cloth or a barrel of ale. The merchant was a client of particular significance. He was a man of some means, but not noble blood. His confidence was earned, not inherited. He arrived from distant cities or the countryside, his mind abuzz with calculations of profit and loss, his body tense from days in the saddle or on a crowded wagon. For him, the visit to the stews or the streetwalker was a form of release from that pressure, but it was rarely an affair of intimacy or even prolonged pleasure. It was another negotiated exchange, often brisk and businesslike. He might be more likely to pay the asked price without haggling excessively, valuing his time and a lack of complication. Yet, this relative financial reliability came with its own coldness. He saw her as a service, akin to a hot meal or a stable for his horse, a necessary accommodation on his journey. He could be dismissive, impatient, and quick to assert the authority his coinage afforded him. His stay was temporary. He would be gone with the next dawn or the next fare, leaving no trace but a few coins and the faint scent of road dust and spices in her room. The traveler was a broader category. The pilgrim between shrines, the journeyman craftsman moving from master to master, the minor cleric on diocesan business, the messenger carrying letters. These men were often alone, far from the social structures of their home communities, and thus unmoored from the constraints of local reputation. The anonymity of the city, and particularly of the brothel district, granted them a license. Chapter 11. Other Clients. Students and Clergy. Beyond the worldly merchant and the rootless traveler, her clientele included two groups whose presence underscored the profound hypocrisy at the heart of the medieval social contract. Students and clergy. These were men ostensibly dedicated to higher pursuits, the life of the mind and the care of the soul, yet they were perennial figures in the shadows of the stews, their patronage a poorly kept secret that the world had tacitly agreed to overlook. The students, particularly in university towns like Oxford, Paris, or Bologna, were a boisterous and volatile source of trade. Young, away from familial oversight for the first time, and bound by the intense, stressful camaraderie of their scholarly pursuits, they frequented the brothels in packs, fueled by cheap wine and a burgeoning sense of masculine privilege. They approached the transaction with a loud, performative bravado, treating it as a rite of passage, a practical lesson in a subject not on the university curriculum. Their patronage was often financially poor, they lived on allowances and loans, and they were notorious for haggling ruthlessly or attempting to cheat the women. They could be cruel in their humor, quoting Latin insults or theological quips she could not understand, using their learning as a weapon to underscore her lowliness. Yet, they could also be surprisingly vulnerable in their drunkenness, revealing fears of failure or loneliness before the mask of arrogance snapped back into place. They were exhausting clients, demanding and often disrespectful, viewing her not just as a service, but as a prop in their own narrative of youthful rebellion and intellectual freedom. Then there were the clergy. From lowly parish priests and friars to canons and even higher-ranking churchmen, They were a constant, if furtive, presence. Their arrival was typically shrouded in more discretion. Some came under cover of their robes, others in secular cloaks, their tonsure. Chapter 12. The ever-present threat of violence. Violence was not an occasional hazard of her profession. It was the atmosphere she breathed. It permeated every interaction, a silent third party in every transaction, shaping her movements, her words, and the very defenses she wore within her own mind. The threat was multifaceted, omnipresent, and stemmed from nearly every direction. The most immediate source was the client himself. The transaction was fundamentally an imbalance of power. He was, in that moment, the absolute authority in the small, locked room or the dark alley. He could decide that the agreed price was too high after the fact, simply refusing to pay. He could turn brutal on a whim, his frustrations or drunkenness finding a convenient, defenseless outlet in her body. A slap, a punch, a worse violation. These were not rare atrocities, but occupational risks. She had no legal recourse. To complain to the authorities was to invite further punishment, as she was often seen as the instigator of disorder, the tempting Eve who had provoked the violence. Her word against his was worthless. Therefore, she developed a keen, instinctual ability to read a man's mood in the set of his shoulders, the slur of his speech, the glint in his eye. Survival depended on this silent calculus of threat. But the danger did not end when the client left. It waited in the streets. Robbery was a constant peril. Any coins she had earned made her a target for common thieves, who knew she carried wealth and that she was among the least protected citizens. She might also face violence from other women, competitors in a desperate market where a prime corner or a favored client could spark brutal, clawing fights over scraps of advantage. The brothel keeper, her supposed protector, could also be a source of brutality, using a cane or a fist to enforce discipline or extract a larger share of her earnings. Then there was the structural violence of the city itself. The watchman, tasked. Chapter 13. No candle after dark. The law of darkness. Of all the ordinances designed to constrain her, none was more symbolically potent or practically cruel than the common law forbidding prostitutes from carrying a candle or lantern after nightfall. This was not a minor regulation. It was a profound act of societal engineering, a deliberate casting of the vulnerable into a void. The law did not merely restrict her movement. It weaponized the very night against her. In a medieval city, darkness was absolute. Once the sun set and the curfew bell sounded, the streets were plunged into a blackness so complete it was tactile. Without moonlight, a person could not see their own hand before their face. This darkness was not empty. It was alive with perils. Open cesspits, piles of refuse, unseen steps, loose stones, and roaming animals. For the respectable citizen, the answer was simple. Carry a light. A candle in a horn lantern pushed back the void, illuminated the path, and signaled one's lawful purpose to the watch. It was a tool of navigation and a badge of legitimacy. By denying her this tool, the law accomplished several things at once. First, it rendered her mobility almost impossible. To venture out for a client or to return to her lodgings was to gamble with broken bones or a fatal fall into a ditch. It physically tethered her to the immediate vicinity of the brothel or her station, reinforcing her containment. Second, and more sinisterly, it made her a perfect target. In the impenetrable dark, she could not see an assailant approaching. She could not identify a robber or a rapist. She was blind, while anyone with ill intent could easily spot the distant glow of a lawful citizen's lamp and avoid it, or could move through the shadows unseen. The law, in effect, created a hunting ground where she was the prey, deliberately stripped of the means to see danger or bear witness to it. Most chillingly, the law of darkness was a profound metaphor for her social enlou. Chapter 14. The soundscape of the night streets. If the law condemned her to darkness, the night itself spoke to her in a language of heightened, disembodied sound. Stripped of sight, her world contracted to an auditory map, every noise a potential signal of threat, opportunity, or the simple, passing tide of life from which she was excluded. The soundscape of the medieval night was not a blanket of silence, but a complex, layered composition, and she was its most attentive and most vulnerable listener. The city's daytime roar softened into a low, persistent hum. From behind shuttered windows came the muffled sounds of domesticity she would never know. A cough, a child's faint cry, the scrape of a bench, the dying crackle of a hearth. These were taunting reminders of a sheltered life. More immediate were the sounds of the street itself. The scuttle of rats in the garbage was a constant percussion. Somewhere, a dog barked, the sound echoing down the narrow canyon of the lane. Distant water lapped against the pilings of a wharf or a bridge. These were the neutral sounds, the background noise of the sleeping city. Then came the meaningful sounds, the ones that demanded interpretation. The most welcome, yet often the most fraught, was the sound of approaching footsteps. Her entire being would focus on that rhythm. Were they heavy and confident, the tread of a guard or a potential client of means? Were they light and quick, a messenger or a thief? Were they slurred and unsteady, signaling a drunken man who could be volatile? Did they come alone? Or was there the murmur of accompanying voices, suggesting a group of rowdy students or soldiers? She learned to discern the crunch of gravel under a leather sole versus the slap of a worn cloth shoe. Each pattern of footfall required an instant, instinctual risk assessment. Other sounds spelled clear danger. The sudden, close rustle in an alleyway that wasn't a rat. The low, hissed conversation of men who did not wish to be. Chapter 16: Medieval Ideas about Contraception. The conclusion of the transaction did not end its potential consequences. For the medieval prostitute, the fear of pregnancy was a specter that haunted every encounter, a threat to her livelihood, her health, and her very life. The knowledge of contraception was a shadowy realm of folk practice, herbal lore, and sheer desperation, existing far outside the sanctioned medicine of physicians or the doctrine of the Church, which viewed any attempt to prevent conception as a mortal sin. The methods available were a patchwork of guesswork and risk. They were not born of reproductive freedom, but of a frantic need to preserve a fragile existence. Some practices were purely superstitious, wearing amulets or certain stones, reciting charms during intercourse, or tying a cord around the thigh. Their efficacy was non-existent, offering only the cold comfort of ritual. More common were barrier methods, primitive and unreliable. A woman might use a vaginal sponge soaked in vinegar or wine, the acidic environment thought to kill the seed. Pessaries made from honey, gum, or animal dung were used in an attempt to create a physical block or a hostile environment. Linen cloths or plugs might be employed. These methods were not only ineffective by modern standards, but also introduced significant risks of infection, poisoning, or toxic shock, adding another layer of physical danger to the act itself. The most widespread contraceptive was likely a form of coitus interruptus or withdrawal. But this method placed all agency and trust in the client, a man who had already paid for his pleasure and had little incentive to cooperate for her long-term safety. To insist upon it could provoke violence or a refusal to pay. Thus, even this most basic of strategies was often outside her control. Herbal concoctions offered another fraught path. Women might drink potions made from rue, pennyroyal, savon, or ergot before or after sex, herbs cayenne. Chapter 15. The Transaction. A brief and businesslike affair. When the footsteps stopped before her, when the negotiation, a terse exchange of a few whispered words and a gestured price, was complete, the core event of her day commenced. This was the transaction. To romanticize it is to betray its reality. It was rarely an act of passion, scarcely an encounter of mutual desire, and never one of intimacy. It was a swift, functional, and profoundly impersonal exchange, as mechanical as a cartwright fitting a wheel to an axle. Efficiency was the governing principle. Time for both parties was a factor. For her, a shorter encounter meant the possibility of another client before the night deepened. For him, it meant a quicker return to the legitimate world, his foray into the shadows neatly concluded. There was no preamble of tenderness, no softening words. The room, if they were in one, offered no comfort or distraction. The client's focus was singular, his goal clear. Her role was to facilitate this goal with the minimum of friction and delay. Her own mind during this time often practiced a form of deliberate absence. To remain fully present in the moment was to confront a pain, physical, psychological, or both, that could be unendurable. So she learned to dissociate. Her gaze might fix on a crack in the plaster of the ceiling, tracing its jagged path. Her thoughts might drift to a fragment of a song overheard in the market, the memory of a warm day from a childhood now impossibly distant, or the simple, mundane calculation of what the coin in his purse might buy her tomorrow. A better meal, a salve for a sore, a respite from the bawd's wrath. This mental retreat was a survival mechanism, a way of sealing off the core self from the repetitive violation of the body. She was both there and not there, a vessel in use while her consciousness sought sanctuary elsewhere. The conclusion was as abrupt as the beginning. The transaction ended not with an embrace, but with a sep. Chapter 17. The Danger of Pregnancy. If the gambles of contraception failed, the specter became a horrifying reality. Pregnancy was not a private, hopeful event. It was a professional, social, and physical catastrophe of the highest order. For a medieval prostitute, carrying a child was a sentence that could unravel the fragile scaffolding of her survival. Professionally, it was an existential threat. The visible progression of a pregnancy meant the rapid erosion of her primary source of income. Clients sought a specific fantasy, and a swelling belly shattered that illusion. As her condition became apparent, her value in the marketplace plummeted. The brothel keeper, seeing a declining return on his investment in her food and lodging, might turn her out onto the street to make room for a more profitable woman. Her period of employability had a brutally short clock, and with its end came the immediate collapse of her ability to feed and shelter herself. Socially, it deepened her condemnation. A pregnant prostitute was the embodiment of sin made flesh, a walking scandal. She would face even greater hostility and ostracization. The child she carried was already branded filius nullius, the child of no one. In the eyes of the law and the church, it had no right to inheritance, no legitimate social standing, and its future was often a bleak echo of her own. The pregnancy was not just a personal crisis, but the creation of another soul condemned to the margins. Physically, the dangers were immense. Her body, likely weakened by poor nutrition, repetitive strain, and possible disease, was ill-prepared for the rigors of pregnancy and childbirth. The work did not stop until her condition forced it to, meaning she likely endured the nausea and fatigue of the first trimesters while continuing to service clients. Access to any form of compassionate midwifery was scarce. Respectable midwives served respectable wives. She would be reliant on the rough, pragmatic knowledge of Oth. Chapter 18. Herbs and Risky Remedies. Confronted with the terror of a missed cycle, the shadowed world of herbal remedies became her only desperate court of appeal. This was not a visit to an apothecary. It was a plunge into a perilous oral tradition of women's secrets, where the line between medicine and poison was gossamer thin, and the pharmacist was as likely to be a fellow prostitute or a shadowy crone as any trained practitioner. The herbs themselves were names whispered in fear and hope. Rue, with its bitter, blue-green leaves. Tansy, with its bright yellow buttons. Pennyroyal, a mint that carried a scent of death. The dreaded Savon juniper. Ergot, a fungus that grew on rye, was known to cause violent contractions. These were not gentle amenagogues to bring on courses. They were toxins, their properties understood only through dangerous trial and fatal error. The knowledge of dosage was vague, passed down as a handful or a brew until dark. Too little, and nothing happened. The pregnancy progressing silently beneath the heart. Too much, and the cure became a catastrophe. The preparation was a grim ritual. She might have to procure the herbs herself, from a specific hedgerow or a dubious cellar at a market's edge, or pay a significant portion of her meager coins to someone who claimed to know the craft. Brewing the tea or concocting the pessary was an act of concentrated dread. As she drank the bitter, scalding liquid, she was not taking medicine. She was accepting a poison, betting her own life against the life growing within her. The ensuing hours were a private agony of waiting, not just for a result, but for the body's reaction to the assault. The effects, when they came, were often traumatic. Violent cramping, copious bleeding, fever, and delirium were not side effects. They were the intended mechanism. Success was measured in survival. If she lived through the ordeal and the pregnancy was terminated, she faced a weakened body, the risk of INF. Chapter 19. The shadow of disease, especially syphilis. Beyond the immediate violence of men and the private terror of pregnancy, there lurked a slower, more insidious, and utterly inescapable threat: disease. In a time before germ theory, where illness was seen as a divine punishment or an imbalance of humors, the prostitute was considered not merely a victim of contagion, but its primary vector, a living source of moral and physical corruption. And of all the afflictions, none cast a longer, more grotesque shadow than the great pox, syphilis. Venereal diseases were a constant occupational hazard, but syphilis, which swept through Europe in the late 15th century, was a plague of biblical proportions for women in the trade. It was a disease that manifested in stages, a slow, theatrical performance of bodily decay that seemed to confirm every sermon about the wages of sin. It began with painless sores, often ignored or hidden. Then came the rashes, the fevers, the aching joints. But its true horror lay in its latency and its grotesque tertiary stage. Nodules and ulcers that could eat away at the skin, cartilage, and bone, disfiguring the face with hideous lesions, collapsing the bridge of the nose, and leading to paralysis, insanity, and a long, agonizing death. For the prostitute, syphilis was a death sentence on multiple levels. Physically, it was a torturous decline. Medically, she had no meaningful treatment. Mercury salves and sweat baths were the standard cures, themselves toxic regimens that caused salivation, tooth loss, and neurological damage, often killing the patient before the disease did. But the social and professional death came first. The visible signs, the rashes, the pallor, the early lesions, meant instant ostracization. A brothel keeper would cast her out to protect the health and profitability of the other women. Clients would flee in terror. She would become untouchable in the most literal sense, a walking monument to decay. This branded. Chapter 20. Payment in coins and in kind. The moment of payment was the fragile culmination of the entire transaction, the point where theory met reality, and promises either solidified into substance or dissolved into air. While the ideal was the clear, cold chink of a coin in the palm, the economy of her world was far more fluid and precarious, often demanding she barter not just her body, but her future needs, in a constant, risky calculus. Coin was king, but it was a monarch of many debased faces. A silver penny was the standard hope, but payment could come in a jumble of foreign coinage, clipped and worn pieces where men had shaved off slivers of precious metal, or even in counterfeit lead slugs disguised by a thin silver wash. Assessing the true value in the dim light required a sharp eye and experience, another small skill necessary for survival. This coin, once verified, was immediately subject to claims. The brothel keeper's cut, a possible bribe for the watch, a debt to the tavern owner. What remained was hers, to be hidden with paranoid secrecy. Sewn into a hem, tucked into a thatched roof, swallowed in a small pouch in extremis, for it was her only lifeline to tomorrow's food and next week's rent. But coin was not always forthcoming. Payment in kind was the other, far more unstable currency of her world. This was the barter economy of desperation. A client might offer a wedge of hard cheese, a half loaf of coarse bread, a measure of ale, or a pair of worn-out shoes. While this met an immediate physical need, it transformed her into a retailer of miscellaneous goods. She now had to convert cheese into a coin, or decide if the shoes fit well enough to be of use, or if they must be traded again, each exchange losing value. Sometimes the kind was a promise. A meal at a tavern later, a place to sleep for the night, the protection of a man's name for a short while. These were the most dangerous payments, contracts written on air, easily revoked and often used. Chapter 21. The constant fear of theft. The moment the coin touched her palm or the object was placed in her hand, a new anxiety ignited, the fear of its loss. In a world where she possessed so little, what little she had was a glittering target. Theft was not a possibility. It was a predictable eventuality, a tax levied by the predatory ecosystem in which she lived. Her earnings were vulnerable from every direction, and guarding them required a vigilance as draining as the work itself. The most immediate threat was the client who had just paid. A common trick was to wait until the transaction was complete. Then, as he dressed or as she turned her back, snatch the coin back or claim it was never given. In the dim light and the hurried aftermath, her word against his was meaningless. A more violent variant was the straightforward robbery by a client who had never intended to pay at all, using the promise of payment to gain access and proximity before turning assaultive. But the danger extended far beyond the client. Her living quarters offered no security. In a shared brothel room, other women, equally desperate and broken by the same system, might rifle through meager belongings for a hidden coin. The brothel keeper, who already took his cut, might demand fines for imagined infractions or simply confiscate money on a whim, citing unpaid debts for food or lodging. There was no bank, no lockbox. Her treasury was her own body and her immediate environment, and both were constantly violated. The walk home, especially if she had enjoyed a marginally profitable night, was a gauntlet. Thieves and cut-purses frequented the dark lanes of the stews, knowing the women who worked there often carried cash and would not be defended by the watch. The watchmen themselves were often the thieves in uniform, demanding a toll or a fine for being out after curfew, effectively legally mugging her. To refuse was to invite a beating or arrest. This constant fear necessitated a lift. Chapter 22: Relations with City Guards and Watchmen. For the average citizen, the city guard or the night watch represented a thin, often unreliable line between order and chaos. For her, they were not protectors, but another class of predator in a uniform of authority. Her relationship with these men was a corrosive dance of corruption and coercion, where the symbols of civic peace were the very instruments of her exploitation. The watchmen knew her, just as the law demanded she be known. Their patrols through the stews or past her regular haunts were not for her safety, but for the regulation of her existence. This oversight granted them immense, unchecked power. The most common interaction was the extraction of a bribe, euphemistically called a fine or a toll. A watchman could stop her and demand payment for any number of invented infractions. Being outside the precise boundaries of the stews, wearing an item that violated the sumptuary codes, or simply for being abroad after curfew, despite the fact that her work required it. The price was his discretion. Payment, often in coin or in the form of her services, bought his momentary blindness and his continued passage. Refusal meant a real arrest, a night in a foul holding cell, a beating, or being driven from a profitable corner. This dynamic made them not just extortionists, but active participants in the trade. A watchman on the take might direct lost or seeking clients toward a particular brothel or woman who paid him a kickback. He might offer a crude form of protection from other thieves or violent clients, protection that, of course, vanished if payments lapsed. In this way, the guard became a de facto pimp, leveraging the power of the state to profit from her body while simultaneously enforcing the laws that oppressed her. The psychological impact of this relationship was profound. It taught her that the entire structure of authority was arrayed against her, not to uphold justice, but to harvest her. Chapter 24: The Church's Unofficial Role as Landlord. Beneath the thunderous official condemnation lay a silent, profitable, and profoundly hypocritical reality. In countless cities across Christendom, the Church, or its individual officers, was a primary landlord of the very brothels it denounced. This was the stark, grimy counterpoint to the sermons, where theology met ledger books, and moral absolutism bowed to institutional revenue. The most famous example was the Liberty of the Clink in Southwark, London, where the brothels, the stews, operated on lands owned by the Bishop of Winchester. The bishop, through his agents, collected substantial rents from the brothel keepers. This was not an anomaly. In medieval Avignon, Marseille, and numerous other European cities, religious authorities, from local parishes to powerful bishoprics and monasteries, owned properties leased for prostitution. The income was often categorized blandly as rents, a tidy euphemism that sanitized the cash flow extracted from sin. This created an unbearable cognitive dissonance that the woman in the stews lived every day. The same institution that preached her damnation, whose priests might refuse her the Eucharist, whose teachings justified her social death, was financially invested in her continued exploitation. The roof over her head, such as it was provided by a system that publicly wished for her redemption but privately required her persistent sin to pay its fees. The rent money that filtered up through the baud to the bishop's coffers might fund the construction of a chapel, the beautification of a cathedral, or the alms for the poor, a circuit of capital that transformed the profits of her body into monuments of piety and acts of charity for others. For her, this unofficial role was the ultimate lesson in power and hypocrisy. It revealed that the moral order was not just a spiritual framework, but an economic one. She was a revenue stream. The Church's stance was not a contrad. Chapter 23. The Church's official stance on sin. The Church was the omnipresent architect of the moral universe, its teachings the very bedrock upon which medieval society understood virtue, vice, and the fate of the immortal soul. Its official stance on the sin of luxuria, lechery, or lust was unambiguous, thunderous, and absolute. From the pulpit, in penitential manuals, and through the terrifying imagery of doom paintings, the message was ceaseless. Sexual sin outside the sanctified bonds of marriage was a direct offense against God, a corruption of the flesh that endangered the eternal spirit. Prostitution was the most public and visible form of this sin, and thus the prostitute became its quintessential symbol. She was cast as a modern-day embodiment of the biblical harlots, a temptress leading men to spiritual ruin. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas, while grappling with Augustine's necessary evil concept, still firmly classified her actions as mortal sin. Her life was a standing rebellion against the divine order, which ordained sex solely for procreation within marriage. In sermons, she was a cautionary tale, a living illustration of the degradation that awaited the wayward. The wages of her sin were not just social scorn, but the very real threat of everlasting damnation, an eternity in the torments of hell, reserved for the lustful. This official condemnation had tangible, daily consequences for her. It was the theological fuel for the laws that constrained her, the sumptuary codes that marked her, the confinement to the stews, the denial of light. It legitimized the violence and ostracization she faced, framing them not as civic injustices, but as natural social reactions to spiritual poison. It informed the attitude of every respectable person who crossed her path, from the matron who pulled her child away to the magistrate who dismissed her testimony. Her existence was a constant, walking sermon on the perils of the flesh, a role she never chose but wore. Chapter 25. A quick meal in a tavern. Amidst the predation and peril, the body's basic demands could not be ignored forever. Hunger was the one client that could not be negotiated with, only appeased. For a brief respite and a morsel of food, she might slip into the lower room of a tavern that tolerated, or tacitly catered to, women like her. This was not a leisurely dinner, but a functional refueling, a transaction as calculated as any other. The taverns near the stews were worlds apart from the respectable inns of the city center. They were low-ceilinged, smoky dens, the air thick with the smell of cheap tallow candles, spilled ale, and unwashed bodies. The light was murky, the benches hard and stained. Here, she was not an anomaly, but part of the expected scenery. She would choose a seat in a corner if possible, her back to the wall, a habit born of perpetual vigilance. The other patrons, boatmen from the river, laborers, petty criminals, and other women from the trade, shared a similar weary exhaustion. Conversation was sparse, low, and utilitarian. Her order was never extravagant. A pot of the weakest, cheapest ale, more water than malt, to wash down the food and momentarily dull the edges of the day. The food itself was sustenance, not cuisine. A coarse trencher of stale bread serving as a plate for a ladle of thin pottage, perhaps a scrap of salted fish or a knob of hard cheese. Every bite was assessed for its cost, not its flavor. This meal was fuel to continue working, to stave off the dizziness that could make her vulnerable. She ate quickly, eyes down, trying to draw as little attention as possible, though the occasional leer or muttered comment from another table was inevitable. This was also a moment of fragile commerce. A client procured earlier in the evening might buy her this meal as part of the transaction, making it a business expense. Or, She might use it as an opportunity to survey the room for potential next clients. Her professional gaze never. Chapter 26. The Company of Other Women. In the bleak landscape of her existence, the other women of the trade were neither simple sisters in suffering nor reliable allies. They were a constant, complex presence. Mirrors of her own plight, competitors for scarce resources, and, on rare occasions, the only source of a brittle understanding solace. Their company was a paradox of shared desolation and necessary distrust. In the brothel or the shared tenement room, they lived in forced intimacy. They saw each other at their most raw and vulnerable, nursing bruises, suffering from illness, weeping in the silent aftermath of a particularly brutal encounter. They shared the same fears of pregnancy, of the bawd's wrath of a client with a knife. In these moments, a fragile, wordless empathy could pass between them. A shared crust of bread might be offered without expectation of return. A warning about a specific violent man, delivered in a terse whisper, was a precious currency of care. They were the only ones who truly understood the arithmetic of each day, the weight of the painted mask, the hollow feeling after the coin was taken. Yet, this same proximity bred friction and rivalry. They were, fundamentally, in competition. A client's choice was a zero-sum game. His coin given to one was coin denied to another. In the tavern or on the street, a woman who was younger, less worn, or more aggressive could easily become a focus of resentment. Fights over territory, a better-lit corner, a spot near a busy tavern door, could erupt into hair-pulling, scratching brawls. Their shared powerlessness turned inward upon each other. The brothel keeper might stoke this rivalry, playing favorites to keep them divided and easier to control. Trust, therefore, was a dangerous luxury. Confidences could be weaponized. A secret about a hidden stash of coins, a private ailment, or a moment of weakness could be sold to the bawd or used as leverage. Survival often meant looking out for oneself. Chapter 27. The Rare Moment of Quiet. In the relentless cycle of negotiation, transaction, and threat, silence was not a given. It was a stolen commodity, a fleeting state to be seized in the brief interstices of the day. The rare moment of quiet was not peace. It was a temporary suspension of the audible world's demands, and within it, she confronted a different, more internal kind of strain. This quiet might descend in the dead hour between the last drunkard's departure and the first gray smear of dawn, when even the watchman's calls grew infrequent. Or it could be found in an empty corner of the brothel courtyard, momentarily abandoned. In these parentheses of time, the defensive clamor of the world receded. The sounds that remained were intimate and stark. Her own breathing, the distant lap of water against a wharf, the settling of the timber in the walls. This auditory emptiness was both a relief and a vacuum. It was in this quiet that the body's complaints, so often shouted over by necessity, made themselves heard. The ache in her lower back from a poorly strung bed, the throb of a tooth, the sting of a fresh bruise, the deep cellular fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. The mind, no longer required to calculate immediate threats or prices, was free to wander, and its wanderings were often perilous. It might drift to memories, not as narratives, but as sensory ghosts. The smell of baking bread from a childhood long severed, the feel of clean linen, the sound of her mother's voice, now distorted by time and shame. These were not comforting thoughts. They were haunting reminders of a humanity that felt like it belonged to someone else. The quiet also forced a confrontation with the sheer, grinding monotony of her existence. The endless repetition of days, each a variation on the same theme of need and degradation, stretched out behind and ahead of her with a terrifying clarity. It was a moment devoid of the distractions that made survival possible. Chapter 28. The smells of the trade, perfume and disinfectant. The air around her was a layered text, a history of the day written in odors. It was a constant, visceral assault, a sensory boundary between her world and the clean, ordered world of hearth and home that existed elsewhere. The smells of her trade were a battle, a desperate, losing campaign to mask the undeniable with the artificial. Beneath everything was the bass note, the scent of the body under relentless use. It was the sour tang of old sweat, the metallic hint of blood, the intimate odor of sex. This was mingled with the environment. The damp wool stink of bedding that was rarely aired, the moldering straw of the mattress, the pervasive, fecal reek of the streets and the chamber pots that were emptied into them. This was the truth of the room, the olfactory reality of the transaction. Against this, she deployed her defenses. Perfume was not a luxury, but a tool of the trade, as essential as the paint on her face. But this was not the delicate floral scent of a noblewoman. It was cheap, strong, and crude, often based on musk or civet. Animalic scents meant to provoke and cover. She might rub her skin with scented pomades or hang sachets of dried lavender and rosemary in the room. The goal was to create a pungent, immediate barrier of fragrance, an olfactory signal that could be detected in a dark alley or a crowded tavern, shouting availability over the stench of the gutter. Yet, in the close confines of her room, the perfume never conquered the base smells. It only melded with them, creating a new, cloying, and unmistakable amalgam, the smell of the profession itself. Then there were the attempts at purification, the rough disinfectants. Vinegar, with its sharp, acetic bite, was used to wash both herself and sometimes the room, believed to cleanse and ward off disease. Strong herbs like rue or wormwood might be burned, their bitter, smoky aroma thought to purify the air. These smells spoke of fear. Chapter 29. The wearing of a distinctive striped hood. In a world without photography or identity papers, society relied on visual codes to instantly categorize its members. For the medieval prostitute, the most ubiquitous of these codes was the mandatory wearing of distinctive clothing, most commonly a striped hood, gown, or other marker. This was not a fashion choice. It was a legally enforced brand, a walking prison uniform that made her status legible at a glance. Sumptuary laws across Europe meticulously dictated who could wear what. Silk, fur, certain dyes, and specific jewelry were reserved for the nobility and the mercantile elite, creating a visual hierarchy of class. For the prostitute, the laws were inverted. They did not grant her the privilege to wear finery, but forced her into a specific, degrading garb to deny her the possibility of blending in. In England, it was often a striped hood or cloak. In France, she might be required to wear a yellow ribbon on her arm or shoulder. In other cities, it was a particular color of dress, like red. The purpose was threefold, each layer more dehumanizing than the last. First, it was for regulation. It allowed authorities, the watch, the bishop's officers, the bailiffs, to instantly identify her and ensure she was in the correct district, not violating the boundaries set for her. She was a moving target for surveillance. Second, it was for protection, but not of her. It served as a warning to honest citizens, particularly men. The striped hood was a public health notice and a moral signpost, signaling contagion and sin so that respectable society could steer clear, preserving their virtue and health by avoiding her. It protected the social order from the pollution of her ambiguity. Third, and most crucially, it was for humiliation. It was a permanent public shaming. It stripped her of individuality and anonymity, forcing her to wear her profession on her body at all times. There was no walking to market UNN. Chapter 30. The concept of necessary evil. Her entire existence was framed and sanctioned by a chilling philosophical and social compromise, the concept of the necessary evil. This was not a description of her life, but a societal alibi, a piece of moral sophistry that allowed the medieval world to profit from her body while condemning her soul. It was a doctrine that exposed the deep, self-serving hypocrisy at the heart of her oppression. Originating in the writings of early church fathers like St. Augustine, the logic was perversely pragmatic. Augustine argued that if prostitution were eradicated, lust would run rampant, leading to the violation of respectable wives and daughters and the greater destabilization of society. Therefore, like a sewer in a city, prostitution was a foul but necessary conduit to channel away excess male desire, protecting the sanctity of marriage and the virtue of honest women. The prostitute, in this analogy, was not a person but a piece of civic infrastructure, a sacrificial drain. This concept provided the intellectual justification for everything we have detailed. It explained why she was tolerated instead of executed. She served a function. It explained her confinement to stews. Sewers are kept in specific, isolated locations. It explained the church's role as landlord. Even a sewer generates revenue for its owner. It explained the branding with striped clothing. One labels a hazard. It even explained the violence against her. Who worries about the dignity of a drain? For the men who used her, it was a convenient absolution. They could partake of the evil, while believing they were upholding the greater social good by containing their lust within its designated vessel. For civic and religious authorities, it resolved a moral dilemma with cold utility. But for the woman living it, the doctrine was a profound violence. It defined her not as a human being with a fate, but as a social utility with a purpose. Her suffering. Chapter 31. The stark contrast with noble women. Her life was a dark, inverted reflection of the women who inhabited the highest strata of medieval society. The noblewoman, ensconced within castle walls or a prosperous townhouse, lived a life defined by protection, purpose, however constrained, and public honor. To hold their reality side by side is to understand the absolute poles of the female experience in the Middle Ages, and the cruel fate of those who fell from one into the abyss of the other. The noblewoman's body was a vessel of lineage and political alliance. It was guarded with ferocious diligence, by fathers, husbands, and servants, until it could be transferred in marriage to secure land, title, or peace. Her sexuality was not her own. It was a commodity of immense social and economic value, its purity defended as a matter of family honor and feudal contract. Chastity belts, though less common than legend suggests, symbolized this mentality of locked-away value. Her function was to produce legitimate heirs, and her life, though often isolated and subject to male authority, was one of sanctioned, respected fertility. The prostitute's body, by contrast, was a commodity of immediate, devalued exchange. It was publicly accessible, its value plummeting with each transaction, its honor, not just lost but legally and theologically annihilated. Where the noblewoman's sexuality was guarded to ensure clear paternity for inheritance, the prostitute's was exploited in a way that deliberately muddied paternity, producing children who were filius nullius, the children of no one. One body was a sealed fortress, the other an open market. Their daily realities were opposites. The noblewoman's day was structured by piety, household management, if she was the lady of the house, embroidery, and perhaps patronage. She moved in spaces of relative cleanliness and order, attended by servants. The prostitute's day was a grind of survival in filth, subject to random violence. Chapter 32. Was there a path out of the life? The weight of the striped hood, the stench of the room, the relentless arithmetic of survival. These forged a cage that few could imagine escaping. Yet, the human spirit clings to the concept of a door, however rusted shut. For the medieval prostitute, a path out of the life did exist in theory, but in practice, it was a narrow, treacherous ledge over an abyss, and few possessed the rare combination of luck, ruthlessness, or grace required to cross it. The most theoretically accessible route was through the very institution that condemned her, the church. A prostitute could, in a profound public spectacle, renounce her life and seek penitence. This might involve a dramatic ceremony where she laid her sinful garments on the altar. She could then enter a convent, not as a nun of high standing, but as a conversa or lay sister, performing menial labor in exchange for shelter, food, and a chance at salvation. This path required genuine religious conviction, the acceptance of a life of hard atonement, and the goodwill of a religious house willing to take her in, a charity not always extended. It was an exchange of one form of bondage for another, albeit one with spiritual hope and physical safety. Another fragile possibility was marriage. A client, perhaps a lonely older widower or a man of similarly low standing with few prospects, might, against all social pressure, choose to marry her. This was a profound risk for him, damaging his own standing. For her, it meant trading the known horrors of the trade for the uncertainties of a domestic life where her past was a permanent, held-over threat. She would enter the marriage with no dowry, no honor, and the ever-present possibility that her husband could use her history against her. Yet, it offered a cloak of respectability, however threadbare, and a legal claim to support. The rarest and most perilous path was that of accumulated capital. If a woman possessed extraordinary bus. Chapter 33. The possibility of marriage. Marriage, the cornerstone of respectable medieval life, existed for the prostitute as a distant, almost mythical shore visible, but surrounded by treacherous currents. To transition from the branded meretrix to a wife was not merely a change in status. It was a perilous metamorphosis that required a near-miraculous confluence of discretion, luck, and the willingness of a man to defy the entire social order. The primary, overwhelming obstacle was her infamous past. In a small, face-to-face society where reputation was everything, her history was not a secret that could be buried. It was a public fact, etched into the collective memory of the city and marked upon her by law and custom. Any suitor would face immediate and severe censure. His own honor would be permanently stained by association. His business dealings could suffer. His standing in his guild or parish could be compromised, and he would become the subject of relentless gossip and scorn. Marriage to her was, for him, an act of social and often economic self-sabotage. Therefore, the men who might consider it were themselves often marginal figures. Older widowers whose own prospects were limited, migrants new to the city with no established reputation to lose, or disabled veterans with few other options. The motivation was rarely romantic. For him, it could be a practical arrangement. She might bring a small, secretly hoarded sum of money, or she represented a chance for domestic labor and companionship without the need for a dowry. For her, the calculation was stark. Trade the known, daily violence of the street for the private, confined dependency of a marriage that began with a foundation of disgrace. Even if secured, such a marriage was fraught with fragility. Her past was a weapon forever in her husband's hand. In any argument, he could wield it to silence her. "Who are you to speak, you whore?" It provided him with a ready-made justification for mistreatment. Chapter 34. The fate of children born in the brothel. A child born within the brothel entered the world already branded. Its first breath was drawn in an air thick with paradox. It was a new life arriving in a place associated with moral death, a symbol of fertility in a trade designed to be, in theory, sterile. Its fate was not a matter of chance, but a predetermined trajectory shaped by the absolute condemnation of its origins. The law had a term for such a child, filius nullius, the child of no one. This legal fiction was among the harshest decrees of medieval society. It meant the child had no recognized father, could inherit nothing, no name, no property, no social standing. Its maternal lineage was equally tainted. Its mother was herself a legal non-person in many contexts. From its first day, the child existed outside the structures of lineage, inheritance, and honor that formed the bedrock of medieval identity. It was a ghost in the machine of society. For the mother, the birth presented an impossible choice. To keep the infant meant attempting the unthinkable, raising a child in the brothel. This exposed the baby to disease, violence, and the grim spectacle of its mother's work. Her ability to earn would be severely hampered, threatening both their lives with starvation. The bawd would see the child as a nuisance, a drain on resources. Yet, the maternal bond, a force as powerful as any law, could compel her to try, dooming them both to a shared, intensified version of her own hardship. The more common, heart-rending recourse was abandonment. This was not done lightly, but as an act of desperate hope. The child might be left at the gate of a monastery, convent, or church, a sacred space where the duty of Christian charity might compel its adoption. This practice was so common it was institutionalized. Some churches had a foundling wheel, a revolving turntable in the wall where an infant could be placed anonymously. If taken in, the child would be rice. Chapter 36. A case study. The Bankside Stews of London. To move from the general to the specific is to see the machinery of containment in perfect, grim operation. The Bankside Stews, on the south bank of the Thames in the parish of Southwark, were not just a red-light district. They were a meticulously regulated municipal enterprise, a case study in how medieval society institutionalized and profited from the exploitation it publicly condemned. Their location was strategic isolation. The Thames acted as a liquid wall, separating the stews from the jurisdiction and the scrutiny of the City of London proper. To reach them, men had to cross London Bridge, a symbolic passage from law and order into a licensed zone of transgression. The area fell under the Liberty of the Clink, owned by the bishops of Winchester. Here, the church's hypocrisy was set in stone. The bishops were the landlords, collecting rents from the brothel keepers, while their clergy preached against the sins practiced on their property. The district was often called the Winchester Geese, a mocking term that highlighted this unholy ownership. The regulations drawn up for the Bankside stews in the 12th century, and refined over time, reveal a bureaucracy of vice. The brothels were licensed. The women, while not allowed to be held against their will, were forbidden from plying their trade outside the district. They could not solicit on holy days. Brothel keepers were held responsible for maintaining a basic, brutal order. Most famously, the rules forbade the women from carrying a candle after dark, a safety measure deliberately denied to ensure their vulnerability and to keep their trade literally in the shadows. This created a contained ecosystem. Boatmen ferried clients across the river. Taverns and gaming houses flourished alongside the brothels. The bishop's officers and the local bailiffs enforced the rules, but their presence was less about protection than about ensuring the smooth, profitable. Chapter 35. The Role of Town Courts in Minor Disputes. The town court, with its bailiffs, its scribes, and its aura of civic order, was an institution from which she was fundamentally alienated. Yet, its mechanisms occasionally brushed against her world, not in matters of high justice, but in the grubby, minor disputes that were the friction of daily survival. Her interactions with this system were never as a protected citizen, but as a problematic variable in the equations of public order and profit. The cases that might involve her were petty in the extreme, yet fraught with peril. A dispute with a brothel keeper over her exact share of coins could, in theory, be brought before a local magistrate. A client who had damaged her few possessions or refused payment might be named, if she dared. A fight with another woman over a stolen cloak or a contested corner could land them both in the dock. In these instances, the court's role was not to find abstract justice, but to quickly resolve a nuisance that threatened the fragile peace of the district. Her testimony was inherently suspect. As a meretrix, her oath held little weight against that of a man of standing, a guildsman, or even the brothel keeper who might be a licensed, tax-paying business entity in the eyes of the town. The law often explicitly discounted the word of women of ill repute. Therefore, appearing in court was a gamble. She risked drawing official attention to herself, which could result in a fine for some infraction of the sumptuary or zoning laws discovered during the proceedings. The process itself was intimidating, conducted in a formal Latin or law French she did not understand, within a space that symbolized the legitimate society from which she was excluded. More often than not, the court's justice was a financial transaction. The judge or bailiff might impose a small fine on both parties to settle the matter, a revenue-generating tactic that punished her regardless of fault. Or he might. Chapter 37. A Case Study. The Rue du Rose of Paris. Across the Channel, in the bustling heart of Paris, a parallel universe of regulated vice existed. The Rue du Rose, or Rue du Rosier, nestled within the right bank parish of St. Mary, was not an isolated district like Bankside, but an infamous, embedded artery of the sex trade. Its story illustrates a different, yet equally controlled, urban model for managing the necessary evil. Unlike the geographically segregated stews of Southwark, the Rue du Rose was woven into the fabric of the city, a notorious street within a working-class quarter. This integration made its regulation more nuanced and its daily reality a tense coexistence with respectable society. The street was so synonymous with the trade that the term filles du rose became a common Parisian euphemism for prostitutes. Its very name, hinting at a flower, was a dark irony against the grime of its reality. The official oversight here was a complex layering of authorities. The Provost of Paris and the Bishop of Paris both claimed jurisdiction, leading to a tangled web of regulations and competing rent collectors. Brothels on the street were often owned by wealthy burghers or ecclesiastical chapters, who prized the steady income. Regulations were strict. Women were forbidden from standing in doorways to solicit, a rule meant to preserve a facade of public order. They were to remain inside, visible through windows or from within, waiting for clients to come to them, a slightly more discreet, but no less confining, form of display. Life on the Rue du Rose was a public spectacle of private commerce. Neighbors, artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, lived and worked alongside the brothels, creating a daily friction. The women were a known quantity, part of the local economy and gossip. This proximity could offer a faint, fragile layer of communal awareness absent in the isolated stews. A neighbor might intervene in an extreme case of violence, if only to prive. Chapter 38. The different tiers. Streetwalker versus courtesan. The term medieval prostitute conjures a monolithic image, but the trade had its own stark, unofficial hierarchy, a pyramid of desperation and precarious privilege. At its broad, suffering base was the common streetwalker or brothel worker. At its vanishingly small, gilded apex was the courtesan. Their days were worlds apart, yet both existed on the same spectrum of commodification. The streetwalker's reality has been the subject of these chapters. A life of legal restriction, physical danger, filth, and sheer economic desperation. She was the human raw material of the necessary evil theory, operating in the open market of the streets or the regulated pens of the stews. Her clients were the merchants, the soldiers, the laborers. Her earnings were meager and precarious. Her survival a daily battle against violence, disease, and starvation. She was the public face of the trade, the one who bore the full brunt of its stigma and legal constraints. The courtesan, in stark contrast, inhabited a shadowland adjacent to the elite. She was a rare phenomenon, existing only in the largest cities and courts. Her currency was not just her body, but cultivated artistry. She might be educated, musically talented, witty, and conversant in the manners of the nobility. She did not wait on street corners. She lived in private, well-appointed chambers, often provided by a wealthy, powerful patron. Her clients were not common men, but nobles, high-ranking clergy, and wealthy merchants seeking a blend of sexual companionship and sophisticated entertainment. Her transactions were veiled as gifts, patronage, and allowances, allowing her a measure of financial security and social maneuvering utterly unimaginable to the streetwalker. Yet, the courtesan's position was profoundly insecure. Her status was entirely dependent on the continued favor of powerful men. She walked a tightrope, needing to be alluring but not threatening. Chapter 39. The illusion of glamour in some tales. Over the centuries, the grim reality of the common prostitute's life has often been painted over with a veneer of romanticized glamour. This illusion, born in later medieval literature and perpetuated in modern imaginations, performs a subtle but profound violence. It sanitizes suffering, transforms exploitation into adventure, and obscures the brutal economics of the body with a sheen of false luxury. These tales often focus on the exceptional, the witty, beautiful courtesan who captivates kings and poets. In fabliaux and some secular poetry, the prostitute is sometimes portrayed as clever and victorious, outsmarting her clients or jealous husbands, a trickster figure who turns the tables on male folly. While these stories might offer a subversive fantasy, they are fables, not documentaries. They ignore the pervasive threat of violence that made such clever retorts a potential death sentence in reality. They forget that the woman who outsmarted a client to earn an extra coin was not playing a game, but fighting for a meal. The setting is often softened. The filthy, freezing brothel room becomes a cozy, if modest, chamber. The stench of tallow and waste is replaced by the scent of cheap perfume. The transaction is framed as a merry, bawdy adventure rather than a hollow, functional exchange. The constant background hum of hunger, fear, and disease is silenced. This narrative laundering makes the profession seem like a viable, even cheeky, career choice, rather than a last resort of the destitute and the socially damned. This illusion serves a comforting purpose for the audience. Then and now, it allows one to contemplate the world's oldest profession without confronting its human cost. It transforms the prostitute from a victim of a harsh system into a willing participant in a risque drama. For the medieval listener, It might soften the moral contradiction of using a service the Church condemned. For us, it risks. Chapter 40. The exhaustion at day's end. As the first gray filaments of dawn unwove the absolute blackness of the night, her work, though never truly finished, found a compelled pause. The exhaustion that settled upon her then was not the wholesome fatigue of labor, but a total depletion. A sinking of the body, mind, and spirit into a profound numbness. It was a weight distinct from sleepiness, a heavy culmination of all the day's transactions. This exhaustion was physical in its rawest form. Her body, an instrument of commerce for hours on end, ached with a deep, familiar soreness. Muscles were strained from tension, from defensive postures, from the mechanical performance of the act itself. Her feet, if she had been standing on cobbles or pacing a room, were swollen and bruised. Her face felt stiff beneath the dried residue of paint and powder, a mask now cracking. Every minor injury, a scratch, a bruise from a rough grip, throbbed with renewed insistence in the stillness. But deeper than the physical was the mental and emotional drain, the hypervigilance required for survival. Reading clients, assessing threats, navigating the dark, guarding her coins, was a cognitive tax that left the mind hollow. The constant performance, the need to project availability and acquiescence regardless of inner feeling, was an act of emotional labor that emptied her reserves. The accumulated slights, the humiliations, the moments of fear swallowed down to complete a transaction, all settled into a leaden feeling in the chest. This was not an exhaustion that promised restful sleep. It was the fatigue of a soldier returning from a battle with no glory, only the grim knowledge that she must fight again in a few short hours. It carried with it the tally of the night, the number of coins earned versus the number of risks survived. As she made her way back to her lodgings, the rising sun did not bring hope, but only illumination for the walk home. The world was waking to a new day of prod. Chapter 42. The cyclical nature of the next day. The dawn held no promise of a new beginning, only the inexorable turn of a wheel. As the gray light filtered into the room, revealing the dust motes and the grime in cruel clarity, the cycle reset itself. The exhaustion of the night before was not shed. It was the foundation upon which the new day would be built, a weight she carried forward. There was no weekend, no holiday, no sanctioned day of rest for her trade. Holy days, when the stews were officially closed, were not respites but crises. A sudden, legislated famine where earning was forbidden, yet hunger was not. The structure of her life was a merciless loop. The waking calculation of emptiness, the donning of the uniform, the strategic positioning, the assessment of threats, the transaction, the fear, the meager payment, the scant meal, the fractured sleep. Each phase bled into the next with a dreadful predictability. Even the small variables, a slightly more generous client, a less violent encounter, a successful barter for a warmer cloak, were absorbed into the grind. They were temporary fluctuations in an unchanging system. A good day did not alter her legal status, remove the striped hood, cure the lurking fear of disease, or grant her an exit. It merely meant a slightly fuller stomach or a small addition to a hidden hoard that could be stolen tomorrow. The wheel turned regardless. This cyclical nature was the ultimate engine of her oppression. It designed hope out of the equation. There was no narrative arc, only a flat, endless circle. The seasons might change outside her window, but the internal season of her life was a perpetual, bleak winter of need. The repetition itself was a form of violence, grinding down resistance, normalizing degradation, making the unthinkable routine. To wake each day was not to embark, but to re-enter the same labyrinth, its walls and traps now familiar in their horror. The next day was not a new chapter. It was the same. Chapter 41. Sleeping in shifts in a crowded room. For the woman not in a private, patron's chamber but in the common stews, sleep was not a private retreat into peace. It was a logistical challenge, a fragile commodity to be snatched in the interstices of other people's waking hours. Her bed was rarely hers alone, and her rest was a communal, fractured, and vulnerable state. In a busy brothel, the room, often just that single, foul chamber, was a piece of capital that could not lie fallow. While one woman slept, another might be working a few feet away, separated only by a thin curtain or a mental wall of dissociation. The sounds were inescapable. The creak of the bed, the murmur of voices, the clink of a coin. Sleep had to be deep enough to ignore this, yet light enough to wake if a threat entered the room. A drunk client mistaking the sleeping pallet, the bawd on a midnight inspection, or a thief. If she shared a room with other women in a tenement, the arrangements were equally precarious. They might sleep in shifts, according to who had worked the latest or who had the earliest chance of a morning client. The pallets, rough sacks stuffed with straw, were laid so close that one could feel the heat and hear the breathing of the woman beside her. There was no privacy for nightmares, for tears, for the small human sounds of pain. Sickness spread rapidly in such conditions. A cough or a fever was a shared sentence. Her few possessions, including any hidden coins, had to be secured even in sleep. She might sleep with a small pouch tied around her neck or wrist, or with her hand thrust into a secret seam in the mattress. This defensive posture twisted the body, preventing true relaxation. The sleep she managed was thin and anxious, punctuated by the stirrings of others, the scurrying of vermin in the thatch, and the city sounds that never fully ceased. This fragmented, collective rest meant she was never truly alone, never truly off duty. Her body might be still, but Chapter 43. The psychological toll of the work. Beneath the visible struggles, the filth, the violence, the hunger, ran a deeper, more silent river of erosion. The psychological toll. This was not a single trauma, but a daily, granular attrition of the self, a wearing away of personhood by the relentless demands of the role she was forced to play. To survive, she had to psychologically fragment, and that fragmentation was its own enduring wound. The most fundamental defense was dissociation, the learned skill of separating the conscious self from the physical experience. During transactions, her mind would retreat, observing from a distance as if it were happening to someone else. This psychic split was necessary to endure the repetitive violations, but it came at a terrible cost. It created a chasm between her inner self and her bodily existence, making her a stranger to her own flesh. This fracture could become permanent, leaving her feeling hollow, disconnected, and unreal even in moments of solitude. Alongside this was the internalization of society's verdict. The church called her a sinner, the law called her a nuisance, the citizens called her filth. To hear this chorus daily, with no counter-narrative, inevitably led to a form of psychic branding. However fiercely she might resist, some part of her would begin to believe she was indeed worthless, damned, and deserving of her fate. This was not low self-esteem, but a structured self-loathing imposed by the world and absorbed as truth. Furthermore, her work demanded a constant, draining performance of false emotion. She had to simulate desire, pleasure, welcome, and subservience for clients who were often repellent to her. This emotional labor, the fabrication and projection of feelings she did not possess, was exhausting and corrosive. It devalued genuine emotion, making her own feelings seem unreliable or meaningless. What was real grief or joy when so many tears and smiles were counterfeit currency? The Cumul. Chapter 44. A note on male prostitution. The shadow world of medieval sex work was not exclusively female. While the vast majority of legal records, sermons, and social anxieties fixated on women, men and boys also sold sex, occupying an even more profoundly hidden and perilous niche. Their experience underscores that the trade's dangers were shaped not just by gender, but by the violation of deeply held societal norms. Male prostitution existed, but it was a crime of a different magnitude. While female prostitution was a necessary evil regulated and contained, sex between men, sodomy, was considered in many parts of medieval Europe a crime in exceptum, a crime so heinous it was often punishable by burning at the stake. A male prostitute, therefore, operated under a double condemnation, the moral stain of selling sex, compounded by the capital crime of homosexual acts. This forced his trade into utter secrecy, far from the licensed stews. Transactions likely occurred in more ambiguous, mobile spaces, bathhouses, certain taverns, the shadows of university districts, or during travel. His clientele was necessarily clandestine. It could include clergy, nobles, soldiers, and merchants, men whose public reputations demanded absolute discretion. This secrecy granted the male prostitute a terrifyingly weak position. He could not seek the dubious protection of a bawd or appeal to any regulating authority without confessing to a capital offense. Blackmail was a constant mutual threat. The client could be ruined by exposure, but the prostitute could be executed. The social identity of the male prostitute was even more erased than that of his female counterpart. There was no equivalent of the striped hood. His marker was invisibility. He likely had to maintain a plausible public occupation as a laborer, servant, or student to explain his presence. This duplicity added another layer of psychological strain. While the female prostitute was a public symbol of sin, the male PR. Chapter 45. How chronicles and records mention them. The medieval prostitute steps into the historical record not through her own voice, but through the dry, glancing mentions of others. She appears in fragments, a ghost in the ledger books and legal scrolls of the society that used her. These records do not tell her story. They record her as a problem, a commodity, or a symbol, and in their very style, they reveal the depth of her objectification. Most commonly, she appears in financial documents. Account rolls from bishoprics or city councils list rents received from brothel properties. From the stews, 12 pence. In these entries, she is invisible, her humanity dissolved into real estate revenue. Court records offer another glimpse, but only when she disrupts the peace. She is named as a defendant, fined for wearing a silk ribbon in violation of sumptuary law, for brawling with another woman, for being found outside the prescribed district. The records state the charge and the fine, a transaction between her and the city's coffers. They never explain the desperation that may have driven her to wear the ribbon or fight for a corner. Legal codes and civic ordinances define her in the negative. They are lists of prohibitions. She shall not, she must not, she cannot. These texts outline the cage but say nothing of the creature inside it. Sermons and penitential manuals mention her as a moral type, the harlot, a generic figure of sin used to frighten congregations. She is a rhetorical device, not a person. Almost entirely absent is her own perspective. No diaries, no letters, no first-hand accounts survive from the common prostitute of the Middle Ages. Literacy was a privilege she was denied, and the daily struggle for survival left no room for memoir. Her inner life, her hopes, fears, memories, and pains, is the great silence at the heart of these records. We see the footprint of her existence in the laws meant to constrain her and the payments made for her use. Bu. Chapter 46. The romanticized version in later stories. As the immediate grimness of the Middle Ages receded into the past, the figure of the medieval prostitute underwent a curious transformation in the popular imagination. Hardened by the distance of centuries, her reality was softened, filtered through a romantic lens that replaced exploitation with adventure and degradation with a rebellious, cheeky agency. This romanticized version, a persistent trope in later literature, art, and now film, performs a subtle but profound disservice, sanitizing history to satisfy a modern appetite for drama over truth. In these tales, she is often witty and wise, a street-smart philosopher who dispenses earthy wisdom. She outsmarts pompous clients and corrupt officials with a clever quip, turning the tables on the power structures that, in reality, crushed her. This archetype transforms systemic victimization into individual triumph, suggesting that a quick tongue was enough to overcome legal non-personhood and physical peril. It replaces the dull terror of the law with the sparkle of dialogue. Her environment is similarly laundered. The stinking, freezing brothel room becomes a cozy, dimly lit tavern chamber filled with laughter and music. The transaction is glossed over, framed as a prelude to romance or a humorous escapade rather than a hollow economic exchange. The ever-present threats of pregnancy, disease, and sudden violence are minimized or erased, replaced by the thrill of clandestine meetings and stolen kisses. She is often given anachronistic freedoms and a rebellious spirit that feels more akin to a modern heroine than a medieval woman fighting for her next meal. This romanticization serves a comforting function. It allows audiences to engage with the titillating idea of the fallen woman without confronting the brutal system that created and consumed her. It transforms a social tragedy into a personal adventure by making her clever and resilient in a glamorous. Chapter 48. A silent figure in the historical record. If history is a conversation across time, the medieval prostitute is its most profound silence. She is the listener in the shadows, present at the event but never its chronicler. The parchment and vellum that preserve the medieval world. Its wars, its laws, its commerce, its piety. Speak of her only in the third person, and most often, in the passive voice. She is acted upon, regulated, fined, rented, condemned. She is a subject but never the author. This silence is not an accident of time. It is the intended outcome of her social and legal status. Illiteracy was her enforced condition, the key to the archive deliberately kept from her grasp. The act of writing was a form of power, of creating a permanent self, and it was a power denied to her by her station, her gender, and her trade. Her story was not deemed worthy of parchment, except as a caution or a commodity entry. Thus, we must read her silence as actively constructed. It is the silence of the managed resource, the necessary evil that must function but not speak. It is the silence of the legally non-existent, whose testimony holds no weight. It is the silence of the theologically damned, whose inner life was irrelevant next to the state of her soul. The records that do mention her, the court fine, the rent ledger, the sumptuary law, are not breaches in this silence but its enforcement. They define the boundaries of her existence without ever inquiring about its content. To study her, then, is to practice a form of historical listening tuned to a frequency of absence. We must attend to what is not said in the sermons, to the gaps in the city accounts, to the spaces between the lines of the legal code. Her voice is not in the words written about her, but in the very fact of their bias, their disgust, and their bureaucratic coldness. Her presence is attested to by the sheer effort expended to control her. In this way, her silence becomes eloquent. Tells you. Chapter 47. Piecing together a life from fragments. To understand her day is to become an archaeologist of the erased. There is no intact vessel, no complete skeleton. Instead, we must sift through the middens of history, the discarded shells and broken shards of records never meant to tell her story, and attempt a fragile reconstruction. Each chapter in this account is a hypothesis built on a scatter of clues, an outline drawn around a central silence. The foundation is legal, the ordinances from London, Paris, Florence, and countless other cities that shout what she was forbidden to do. From these prohibitions, we infer the reality. A law banning her from wearing a silk veil tells us some tried to blur the lines of status. A statute fining her for carrying a candle reveals the terrifying darkness of her nights. Court rolls listing fines for brawls or being out of bounds sketch the edges of her confined world and the tensions within it. Financial records provide another ghostly impression. The Bishop of Winchester's account books listing rents from the Southwark stews do not mention her pain, but they meticulously record the economic architecture that profited from it. Tax assessments on brothel keepers hint at the scale of the trade. These dry numbers are the footprints of a vast, silent suffering. Medical and theological texts offer a distorted reflection. Surgeons' notes on the Great Pox describe symptoms that ravaged her community, while preachers' diatribes against the harlot crystallize the social contempt she faced. Even literature, the fabliaux, the romances, though fictionalized, provides hints about societal attitudes and the popular myths that grew around her. But at the center of this collage of sources, there is a void. We have the price of her room, but not her dreams. We have the description of her disease, but not her fear. We have the law that marked her, but not her tears. Piecing together her life is therefore an act of respectful deduction. Chapter 49. The harsh reality behind the term. Throughout these chapters, we have used the word prostitute. It is a clinical, modern term, a categorical box. But for the medieval woman living it, there was no such abstraction. The harsh reality behind the term was not a profession, but a predicament. It was not an identity, but a situation of total vulnerability enforced by law, economics, and theology. The term implies a transaction, a consensual exchange. In her world, consent was a hollow concept. What choice exists between selling one's body and watching one's child starve, or facing the street without a penny for lodging? Her consent was the signature on a contract written by desperation, where the only other option was destitution or death. The transaction was not between equals, but between a person with needs and a person with power, where her need was always greater. It implies a service provided. But the service was her own diminishment. Each act was not a job performed, but a piece of her personhood bartered away. Her body rendered a tool, her humanity slowly estranged from itself through dissociation and performed emotion. The service was the systematic unraveling of the self. Most of all, the term professionalizes what was, in essence, a state of sanctioned prey. She was not a worker in a protected trade, but a target in a managed hunt. The laws did not protect her labor. They corralled her for easier use. The city did not pay her a wage. It allowed her to be paid by individuals while taxing her through fines and bribes. The church did not offer her solace. It profited from her rent and used her as a rhetorical scarecrow. Therefore, to speak of the medieval prostitute is to speak of a human being who existed in a state of permanent, designed crisis. The harsh reality behind the term is the story of a person forced to use the only asset society left her, her body, in a marketplace rigged against her, for a survival that was meager, perilous, and Chapter 50, reflecting on a day designed for survival. As the final gray light of this long day fades, we are left not with a narrative, but with a condition. To recount the hours, from the hollow waking to the fractured sleep, is to trace the contours of an existence meticulously engineered for bare survival, and nothing more. Every law, every social custom, every economic pressure was a cog in a machine that produced one outcome: her maintained availability for use, at the absolute minimum cost to the society that demanded it. Her day was not an accident of history, but a design. The striped hood, the confined district, the denied candle, the discounted testimony. These were not random hardships, but interlocking components of a system. This system served a clear, cold purpose: to provide an outlet for male desire while protecting the sanctity of marriage and the hierarchy of class. To profit from sin while condemning the sinner, to benefit from a service while vilifying the servant. She was the shock absorber for societal contradictions, bearing the friction so the machinery of respectability could run smoothly. To reflect on her day is therefore to witness the logical endpoint of a theology and a social order. It reveals what happens when a human being is legally and theologically reclassified as a utility. Her suffering was not a bug in the system. It was its primary function. The exhaustion, the fear, the disease, the early death. These were the calculated, accepted outputs of the equation of the necessary evil. In the silence that follows this reflection, we must confront a difficult truth. The medieval prostitute's day holds up a dark mirror to any society. It asks how we, too, design systems that create classes of people deemed expendable, whose suffering we rationalize as necessary for the comfort, order, or morality of the whole. Her story is not a relic, but a lesson in the architecture of human suffering.